Strange, isn't it? How a life can look perfectly fine on the outside, yet feel quietly empty on the inside. The routine works. Responsibilities are handled. People even say you're doing well. And yet, in certain quiet moments, maybe early in the morning or late at night, a soft question appears. Not loud, not dramatic, just a quiet whisper in the mind. Why does something still feel missing? Most people assume the answer must be somewhere ahead of them. A new plan, a new achievement, a different direction in life. But what if the opposite were true? What if the feeling of peace you're searching for isn't something you need to build, but something you simply need to remember? Because sometimes the soul doesn't disappear when life becomes busy. It doesn't leave when we start reacting too quickly or when disappointment slowly piles up. It does something much quieter than that. It waits, patiently, and every once in a while, life gives us a small sign, a moment of silence, a forgotten object, a simple breath that feels deeper than the last one, something gentle that seems to say, "Come back for a moment. You've been gone too long." The story you're about to hear begins exactly there, not with a dramatic breakdown or a life falling apart, but with a man who had done everything he thought he was supposed to do, only to realize that somewhere along the way, he had quietly drifted away from himself. And strangely enough, the thing that helped him find his way back was something most people overlook every day. Something simple, something patient, something that had been waiting for him all along. There was a man named Daniel who had built a life that looked from the outside perfectly fine. The kind of life people nod at approvingly. A steady routine, a home that stayed quiet at night, responsibilities neatly handled one after another. Yet sometimes, usually in the early morning before the world fully woke, he felt a strange hollowness inside his chest. Not pain exactly, just a soft echo where something meaningful used to live. He couldn't quite explain it. Everything was technically working, but now and then, while pouring coffee or staring at a screen too long, a quiet thought slipped through. Is this really it? And that small question lingered like a faint melody he almost recognized but couldn't quite name. To avoid the feeling, Daniel stayed busy. Busy was convenient that way. When the mind moves quickly enough, it rarely stops to ask uncomfortable questions. Still, even during crowded days, something inside him felt oddly distant, like waving at someone through fog and never receiving a reply. Every once in a while, the feeling surfaced during simple moments. A careless comment from someone, a cold silence after a disagreement, or that subtle sting when someone dismissed something he cared about. Little things, really, yet they seemed to press gently on that same empty space. One evening after a particularly long day, Daniel sat quietly in his living room. No television, no music, just the low hum of the refrigerator somewhere nearby. And for a moment, he noticed how tired his reactions had become, how quickly irritation arrived, how easily disappointment settled in. It felt like carrying a heavy backpack he couldn't remember packing. Strangely enough, the quiet made something clearer. Under all the activity, something inside him was simply missing, not broken, not lost forever, just forgotten perhaps, like an old song stored somewhere in memory. And the realization stirred a gentle ache he couldn't ignore anymore. That night he stood by the window, watching the streetlights glow softly against the pavement. Life outside moved as usual. Cars passing, neighbors walking their dogs, ordinary rhythms continuing. But Daniel felt a subtle longing rise inside him, a wish to feel truly present again, to feel alive in a way that didn't depend on constant motion. He didn't yet know what he was searching for. Only that something essential seemed buried beneath the noise of daily life, and somewhere deep inside, almost like a whisper carried on a quiet breeze, a small question appeared again. What if peace begins the moment someone remembers what truly matters within? The next morning arrived quietly, the way ordinary mornings often do. Sunlight slipped through the curtains in thin golden lines, settling gently across the room. Daniel sat at the kitchen table with his coffee, noticing something unusual. For once, he hadn't reached for his phone right away. The silence felt unfamiliar, but strangely welcoming. At first, the quiet made him slightly restless. His mind wanted to jump somewhere. Tasks, messages, unfinished conversations. But he stayed seated for a moment longer than usual, just breathing slowly, letting the steam from the mug curl upward. And little by little, the rush inside him softened. It was a simple thing, really, just sitting without filling every second. Yet Daniel noticed something surprising. The heaviness he carried didn't shout in silence. It whispered instead, and whispers, unlike noise, could finally be heard. He began to realize that maybe the emptiness wasn't a failure. Maybe it was more like a quiet signal, a gentle reminder that somewhere along the way, he had drifted away from himself, not dramatically, just gradually, the way people do while trying to keep everything together. Life had given him roles to play: worker, friend, responsible adult, problem solver. He had worn them well, like carefully chosen jackets for different seasons. But somewhere beneath those layers, there was still a quieter version of him waiting patiently, one that rarely got asked how it felt. And perhaps, he wondered, peace didn't come from fixing everything outside. Perhaps it came from remembering what existed underneath those roles. The part that wasn't trying to prove anything. The part that simply existed, steady, calm, and quietly alive. A part he hadn't listened to in a very long time. Later that day, when someone made a sharp remark at work, Daniel noticed something new. Usually he would react quickly, defend himself, replay the comment all afternoon. But this time he paused for just a breath. One slow inhale, one slow exhale, and the moment passed like a cloud drifting across the sky. That small pause revealed something important. Peace, it seemed, wasn't something far away waiting to be discovered. It was already present, hiding in the spaces where noise faded. And if someone slowed down enough to listen carefully, they might begin to remember who they were beneath everything else. Daniel didn't fully understand it yet, but somewhere inside, a quiet shift had begun, like the first step onto a forgotten path, faint, overgrown, barely visible. A path that might, just might, lead him back to something essential he had left behind. Daniel had done what most people quietly hoped to do. He had built stability. His days moved in reliable patterns, and from the outside, his life looked balanced enough. Friends sometimes said, "You got things figured out." He usually smiled when they said that, though the smile never stayed long. Inside, things felt different. Not chaotic, not tragic, just strangely empty. Like walking through a house where all the furniture was perfectly arranged, yet the rooms somehow lacked warmth. Everything was in place, and still something essential was missing. To avoid noticing it too clearly, Daniel kept himself occupied. There was always something to adjust, answer, or improve. When silence tried to appear, he filled it quickly. A message, a video, a task, even rearranging something on his desk. Anything that kept the quiet questions from returning. But late at night, the distractions grew thin. That was when the mind slowed enough to wander. And sometimes a familiar fear slipped gently into his thoughts. A quiet, unsettling idea that he rarely admitted out loud. What if this feeling never goes away? On certain days, the world seemed unusually sharp. A careless criticism from a colleague stayed in his mind for hours. A brief moment of rejection felt heavier than it should. Even a passing rude comment from a stranger could echo longer than expected, as if his inner world had grown more fragile than before. He began noticing how quickly his emotions reacted. A small inconvenience could stir irritation. A misunderstanding brought a wave of frustration. Then came the quiet shame afterward. That familiar thought, why do I feel so tired of everything lately? Sometimes he would sit on the edge of his bed in the evening, rubbing his forehead as if trying to smooth away invisible wrinkles in his mind. Nothing dramatic had happened that day, yet he felt drained in a way that sleep alone couldn't repair, like a battery slowly losing its charge. Once, while brushing his teeth, he caught his reflection lingering longer than usual. He studied his own eyes for a moment, not judging, just noticing. There was a heaviness there he didn't remember from years before, a quiet fatigue that seemed to ask for something deeper than rest. Daniel didn't yet know what he needed. He only knew that beneath his well-organized life, something inside him felt distant. And somewhere nearby, though he couldn't quite see it yet, a small forgotten piece of his inner world waited patiently, as if it had been sitting quietly for years, hoping he'd finally notice. One quiet Saturday afternoon, Daniel decided to clean a small storage room in his apartment. It was the kind of place people rarely visit unless something is broken or missing. Boxes stacked over boxes, forgotten cables, old notebooks, winter jackets from years ago. Dust floated gently through the air each time he moved something aside. The room smelled faintly of time passing unnoticed. While shifting a narrow wooden box near the wall, he noticed something tucked behind it. An old guitar case. Dark brown leather, edges worn, a thin layer of dust resting across its surface. Daniel paused for a moment, tilting his head slightly. He hadn't seen that case in years. Slowly, he lifted it onto the table. The metal clasps clicked softly when he opened them. Inside lay the guitar he had once played almost every evening. Its strings were dull now, and one had snapped quietly at some forgotten moment. The instrument looked patient, as if it had simply been waiting. Daniel ran his fingers lightly across the dusty wood. A faint line appeared where the dust moved aside. He couldn't help but smile a little, the kind of smile that arrives with old memories. There had been a time when music came naturally to him, before life became so full. Back then, he used to sit near the window after long days. Sometimes he played softly, sometimes he just held the guitar and strummed slowly. The melodies weren't perfect, but they carried something real, a small sense of quiet belonging to himself, something he hadn't felt in a very long time. Now the instrument seemed to reflect something deeper, not just forgotten music, but a forgotten part of him, the part that once paused, listened, created, the part that didn't measure life by tasks or reactions, the part that simply existed. He noticed the dust gathering in the corners of the case, tiny gray particles that had settled over time, unnoticed. And suddenly the image felt strangely familiar. His own inner world, perhaps, had gathered dust the same way, not through neglect exactly, just through years of quiet postponement. Daniel didn't rush to fix the guitar. He simply sat there for a moment, holding it gently in his lap. His thumb brushed one of the loose strings, producing a soft, imperfect sound. Not quite music, but not silence either. Something in between. And as that faint vibration faded into the room, Daniel wondered, almost curiously, if the instrument hadn't been waiting all along, not just to be played again, but to remind him of something he had quietly set aside. A few days after finding the old guitar, Daniel carried it with him while walking through a small park near his apartment. He wasn't quite sure why he brought it. Maybe he just didn't want it gathering dust again in that storage room. The afternoon air was mild, and the trees swayed slowly, as if the world had decided not to hurry that day. Daniel sat on a quiet bench and rested the case beside him. He opened it for a moment and gently touched the strings. The sound that came out was uneven and slightly tired. He chuckled softly to himself. "Well, we're both a little rusty," he murmured. The guitar, of course, didn't answer, though somehow it didn't feel completely silent either. Not far away, an older man sat feeding crumbs to a few curious birds. His movements were slow but steady, the kind that seemed unbothered by time. He watched Daniel for a moment with calm, observant eyes. Then he stood and wandered over, hands loosely tucked in his jacket pockets. "Old friend?" he asked, nodding toward the guitar. Daniel smiled faintly. "Very old friend," he replied. "I used to play all the time, years ago." The man nodded as if that explained more than the sentence itself. Sometimes silence speaks more clearly than advice. The stranger introduced himself simply as Elias. His voice carried a gentle warmth, not overly cheerful, just quietly present. He sat on the bench beside Daniel without rushing the moment. For a while, they both watched the breeze ripple through the leaves above them. It felt strangely comfortable, sharing the quiet with someone who didn't try to fill it. After a moment, Elias glanced at the dusty edges of the guitar case. "You know," he said calmly, "instruments are patient things." Daniel tilted his head slightly. "They don't complain when they're forgotten. They simply wait until someone remembers how to listen again." Daniel let that sentence settle for a moment. Something about it felt larger than it sounded, almost as if Elias wasn't talking about the guitar alone. Daniel rubbed the back of his neck, thinking quietly. "Feels like I forgot more than just music," he admitted. Elias didn't react with surprise or correction. He only nodded slowly, the way someone does when hearing something familiar. "The interesting thing about the soul," he said softly, "is that it never really leaves. It just waits, patiently, for a little quiet." Daniel looked down at the guitar again. For the first time, the dust on its surface didn't feel like neglect. It felt more like a message he had finally paused long enough to notice. And somehow, without realizing it yet, a small doorway inside his life had just begun to open. The two of them remained on the bench a little longer, watching the slow rhythm of the park. A dog passed lazily with its owner, birds hopped across the grass, and somewhere nearby a bicycle bell chimed softly. Elias didn't rush the conversation. He seemed to understand that certain thoughts need space before they appear. Daniel rested the guitar across his knees, quietly tracing the worn edge of the wood. After a while, Elias nodded gently toward the instrument. Sometimes the first step isn't playing, he said. It's simply clearing away the dust. Daniel brushed his hand across the guitar again, watching the particles scatter in the sunlight. The gesture felt oddly meaningful. You see, Elias continued softly, most people try to fix their lives by adding more noise, more plans, more explanations, more reactions. But the soul usually speaks in a different language, a quieter one, the kind that only appears when someone pauses long enough to hear it. Daniel listened, his shoulders relaxing slightly. He realized how rarely he allowed silence to exist around him. Even his thoughts tended to run quickly, jumping from one worry to the next. The idea of simply listening felt unfamiliar, but strangely relieving. Elias reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small cloth. He handed it to Daniel with a faint smile. Go on, he said gently. Daniel began wiping the guitar slowly, watching the wood regain its warm color. The action was simple, almost meditative. As he cleaned the surface, Elias spoke again. Alignment doesn't happen through force. It happens through honesty. When someone allows themselves to notice what they truly feel, even if the feeling is uncomfortable at first. Daniel paused and took a slow breath without thinking. The air filled his lungs, then left again just as calmly. Elias noticed and nodded slightly. Exactly like that, he said. One breath can already make space. They sat quietly for a moment. Daniel placed his fingers lightly on the strings. He didn't try to play a song. He simply listened to the soft vibration when he plucked one note. The sound faded slowly into the open air. You don't need to force your way back, Elias said softly. The soul isn't far away. It's just waiting for moments like this. Moments where nothing is demanded, and everything is allowed to be heard. Daniel looked at the guitar again, now cleaner than before. The instrument seemed different somehow, though nothing had truly changed. And somewhere inside his chest, a small quiet space had opened, as if something within him had just begun to breathe again. Over the following days, something subtle began to change in Daniel's routine. Nothing dramatic, nothing anyone else would immediately notice. But once in a while, instead of filling every quiet moment, he allowed a little space to remain. Just a minute here, a breath there. Small pauses that felt almost unfamiliar at first. In the evenings, he sometimes sat by the window with the guitar resting across his lap. He didn't rush to play full melodies yet. Instead, he plucked a single string and listened to the sound fade into silence. It felt oddly calming, like watching ripples settle on still water. A simple reminder that not everything needed to happen quickly. At first, the quiet wasn't entirely comfortable. Old thoughts wandered in, memories of criticism, awkward moments, disappointments that once stung. Daniel noticed how easily those echoes still tried to pull him into reaction. But now he had a small practice Elias had hinted at. One slow breath before responding to anything inside. When frustration appeared, he would pause for a moment. Just 2 gentle breaths. Nothing complicated. Sometimes he placed his fingers lightly on the guitar strings, as if grounding himself. The cool metal under his fingertips seemed to steady his thoughts. A quiet signal that he didn't have to follow every emotional wave. Little by little, the instrument began to sound different too. The notes grew clearer as he tuned the strings one by one. Each adjustment was small, almost invisible, yet the harmony slowly returned, like a voice remembering its own tone. Daniel couldn't help noticing the parallel. His inner world seemed to tune itself the same way. Moments that once triggered irritation now softened more quickly. A rude comment still arrived, of course. Life hadn't changed that. But instead of carrying the sting for hours, he sometimes let it drift past, like dust shaken gently from an old surface. One evening he realized he had played 3 simple chords in a row. The sound filled the room softly, not perfect but warm. Daniel smiled, a quiet satisfaction spreading across his face. Not because he had mastered anything again, but because something inside him felt awake. The transformation wasn't loud or dramatic. It unfolded the way dawn does, slowly, quietly, almost unnoticed. Yet Daniel began sensing that the forgotten path inside him was clearing, and as the music returned in small fragments, life itself seemed ready to reveal a new rhythm he hadn't heard before. As the weeks passed, Daniel began noticing how the quiet practice followed him into ordinary moments. Life outside hadn't slowed down. Deadlines still appeared, conversations still carried tension, and people remained wonderfully unpredictable. Yet something inside him now moved at a different rhythm, a calmer one that didn't rush to react. One afternoon at work, a colleague made a sharp remark during a meeting, the kind that once would have echoed in Daniel's mind for the rest of the day. For a brief second, the old reflex stirred inside him, that familiar urge to defend, explain, prove himself right. But his fingers gently pressed together, almost remembering the guitar strings. He paused for one quiet breath, just a moment, barely noticeable to anyone else in the room. The tension inside him softened slightly, and when he spoke, his voice came out steady instead of defensive. The conversation moved on as if the storm had never formed. Later that evening, walking home, Daniel reflected on the moment. It wasn't about winning or losing an argument. It was about choosing which part of himself responded, the hurried part that chased approval, or the quieter part that simply remained grounded. At home, the guitar waited near the window where he now kept it. The dust no longer gathered there. Sometimes he played a few notes before dinner, sometimes only one. Other times he simply rested his hand on the wood and breathed slowly, a tiny ritual that took less than a minute. He noticed the same calm appearing during unexpected moments, when someone's rude words brushed past him at a store, when disappointment arrived after plans changed suddenly, even when loneliness visited during long evenings. Instead of fighting the feeling, he allowed it to pass through. The guitar had become more than an instrument now. It was a quiet reminder. Whenever his thoughts tangled themselves again, he would lightly pluck a string. The sound vibrated gently through the room, and with it, his mind seemed to settle. What surprised Daniel most was how simple the shift had been. No grand transformation, no dramatic turning point, just small moments of listening, repeated quietly each day. And somehow those tiny pauses began shaping the entire direction of his life. Still, there was one thing Elias had hinted at that Daniel hadn't fully explored yet, a way to help others notice the same quiet doorway inside themselves. Something simple enough that anyone could try it, even in the middle of an ordinary day. One evening, as the sun dipped quietly behind the buildings, Daniel found himself back in the same park where he had first met Elias. The bench was empty this time, though the gentle rhythm of the place felt familiar. Children's laughter drifted faintly in the distance. Leaves rustled softly overhead. Daniel carried the guitar with him, resting it beside him like an old companion. For a moment, he simply sat there and breathed. He remembered something Elias had once said, almost casually. Most people think peace requires a big change. But Elias had smiled after saying it, as if amused by the idea. Usually it begins with a single honest minute. Daniel hadn't fully understood it then, so he decided to try something simple. He closed his eyes and asked himself one quiet question. What truly nourishes my soul today? No complicated answers were required, just whatever appeared first. At first his mind wandered through familiar distractions, tasks, obligations, unfinished conversations. But after a few calm breaths, something clearer surfaced. A small, simple answer, almost shy at first. Moments like this, when I actually slow down. Daniel opened his eyes and reached into his pocket. He pulled out a small notebook he had recently started carrying. Nothing fancy, just a place for a single sentence now and then. He wrote quietly, "Peace begins when I allow myself to listen." The act took less than a minute, yet it felt strangely grounding, like placing a small stone to mark a path through tall grass. A reminder that the direction mattered more than speed, and that clarity often arrives in the quietest spaces. Before leaving the park, Daniel plucked one gentle note from the guitar. The sound floated briefly through the evening air. He watched the vibration fade, just like Elias had once shown him. A soft rhythm of presence, appearing and dissolving. Simple, honest, enough. He realized anyone could try the same thing. 1 minute of quiet breathing, one honest question asked without pressure, one short sentence written down without judgment. A small practice, yet powerful in its simplicity. Daniel closed the guitar case and stood slowly. As he walked away, a quiet thought settled in his mind. If something so small could reconnect a person to themselves, perhaps the real secret had never been hidden at all. Perhaps people had simply forgotten where to look. The seasons shifted slowly after that evening in the park. Nothing about Daniel's life looked dramatically different from the outside. He still woke up early, still walked the same streets, still handled the ordinary rhythms of the day. But inside, something had settled into a quieter harmony, like a room that had finally been aired after years of closed windows. The guitar remained near the window where sunlight touched it every morning. Its wood now carried a gentle glow instead of dust. Some days Daniel played a few soft melodies. Other days he simply rested his hand on the strings and listened to the stillness. Both felt equally meaningful. He began noticing that peace wasn't something he had to chase anymore. It appeared naturally when he returned to himself, when he paused before reacting to harsh words, when he allowed disappointment to pass without tightening around it, when he remembered to breathe before answering the world. The instrument had quietly become a teacher, not through music alone, but through what it represented. Every note reminded him that harmony doesn't come from forcing sound. It comes from tuning gently, listening carefully, adjusting with patience, the same way the inner life finds balance. Sometimes Daniel thought about the many years he had spent feeling disconnected, not broken, just distant from his own center, and he realized something that would have surprised his younger self. The soul had never abandoned him. It had simply waited for a moment of quiet recognition. One evening, as golden light filled the room, Daniel played a slow series of chords. The melody drifted softly through the air, steady and warm. He smiled slightly, noticing how natural it felt now. Not perfect, not impressive, just honest. And somehow that honesty carried its own quiet beauty. Outside, the world continued with all its usual noise: voices, hurried footsteps, passing frustrations, unexpected joys. Yet inside that small room, the music moved calmly between the walls, a reminder that peace wasn't something separate from life. It was simply life lived in alignment with the soul. And somewhere within that quiet melody, Daniel understood a truth that felt both simple and profound. When a person returns to what is real inside them, even the smallest note of life can shine like a steady light in the darkness.